if you'd rather not, I think he'll record just Nagabodhi, but if you want to be quite sure you're not appearing on the recording, just turn off your video. Have I forgotten anything? Okay. Over to you, Nagabodhi.
Yep. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Lots of nodding heads, whoopee. Just to warn you all, I've never given a talk this way before, so it's a first for me, and I hope I find the right sort of tone to engage you. Not having a sort of an audience out there, but in a way you are out there. In fact, you're more out there than ever. So I'm hoping I'll be able to reach you and interest you for a period of time about Dr. Ambedkar, about whom many of you, I suspect, know little or nothing. Even many members of our order, when they attended a convention in Bodh Gaya a couple of years ago, were surprised, even in some cases shocked, to see that the shrine in this enormous temporary space, it was a kind of a, what would you call it, a semicircular, like an Anderson shelter, only big enough to take 600 people. And up at the end was a stage with a shrine, and a picture as usual of Bhante on the shrine, a Buddha image, and dwarfing the shrine was an enormous photograph of a bespectacled, portly Indian gentleman. And some people were a little bit surprised to see who, this person, and wondered why he was there and why he seemed to occupy such a prominent space. Well, if you go to India and if you travel around any city, you'll probably see a statue of this man. Usually you'll see him holding under one arm a big book, and while the other arm sort of points in some unknown direction, presumably just forward or onward. It's an inspirational statue. Sometimes it'll be a very finely made institutional statue, like the one standing outside the Houses of Parliament, the Indian Parliament. Sometimes it'll be incredibly crude, but there he'll be in often the very poorest parts of the town. A crude statue, but there he is in his suit with pens in his pocket, even glasses sort of made out of wire frames perched on his nose, pointing forwards. Sometimes his statue will be in a cage, and sometimes you'll find shoes lying on the ground around it that have been thrown at it, which is, a little part of the story. These statues and the posters that you'll see dotted around the place, I can maybe just share one with you if I can, if my computer's up to the technology of sharing a screen. Nope. Oh, yep, here's one. Just see if you can see that. It's all happening. I can't hear you, but can you nod, Satchalila, if you can see it? Yeah, this is sort of typical of the kind of poster that you'll find now all over India tonight, because no doubt people are celebrating this man's birthday at huge rallies where people will be selling posters like this, showing this man with his book under his arm, pointing the way forward. And this is Dr. Bhimrao Ramji Ambedkar. He was an educationalist, an activist, a lawyer, an economist, a politician, a minister in Nehru's government, the man who, in fact, played the lion's share in drafting the constitution of newly independent India. He was the leader of the most downtrodden people in India, possibly in the world, and was the man who set rolling the wheel of the Dharma, the man who brought Buddhism back to India. That's his CV. He was the unquestioned leader, and in a way still is the unquestioned leader of millions of the poorest people in India. And this man, Dr. Bhimrao Ramji Ambedkar, in India is revered in a way that's hard to imagine by these poorest people. His picture will occur in pretty much everyone's house, maybe an old tattered photograph of him. he's omnipresent in the life of people who once upon a time were untouchables, some of whom converted to Buddhism, even those who didn't convert to Buddhism, and I'll tell you the story of that in a little while, still revere Ambedkar. And actually, if anything, his star has been rising in recent years, despite the fact that they have a very, very powerful fundamentalist Hindu regime in charge of India. Nevertheless, even the BJP politicians these days have to some extent, kowtow to images and statues of Dr. Ambedkar. So important is his position in Indian history and in the history of modern India. So what I'm going to try and do is give you a sense of this man who on the one hand was, this pursuited economist, lawyer, barrister, politician, but also an absolute firebrand activist who devoted his entire life to the uplift of his people. And with the words his people, I segue into a little bit of biography. And I think in the case of understanding Ambedkar, an awful lot of it, if you like, is done quite easily in a sort of linear way by just telling you a little bit about his life story. And that will give you the measure of the man. So he was born in 1891 in a small village. His father, because of a kind of arrangement made by the British during the time of the Raj, had a position in a branch of the army and was in fact something called a Subedar Major. So he enjoyed quite high rank within this branch of the army that was made available to people from India's downtrodden classes. So there was a little bit of a kind of an aspiration atmosphere in what was in fact a very, very poor home. I say a poor home, it was kind of more than a poor home. It was a home inhabited by a family and living in an area of the village inhabited by people known as untouchables. And they were called untouchables because that's literally what they were. Their touch, even sometimes their sight, even their shadow was believed by the Hindu majority to be in some way intimately polluting. If you saw, even if you saw one, you would have to have yourself purified by performing various rituals, certainly by touching one. Untouchables enjoyed a place in Indian society, in a sense, right outside of the caste system. How this began, how the caste system began, and how the practice of untouchability began, is still lost in the sort of mists of history. If you go to Wikipedia and look up untouchability, what you'll find is something like 6 or 7 or maybe even more theories as to how this practice, how even the caste system in its more sort of developed form evolved. It was around even in the Buddha's day on a very simple level, and over the years became increasingly sophisticated, but in a way that increasingly made a certain segment of society to be considered untouchable, even unseeable. So low was their status. In terms of work, they would perform the most degrading occupations, like cleaning out people's latrines, coming along to collect night soil, as it's politely called in Indian literature, from their homes, and all sorts of the lowest degrading work. They were pretty much outside the law. They could be beaten up, they could be raped. And I'm sorry to say it, that even these days in village India, stories of this practice go on, even though untouchability has been officially outlawed since Ambedkar wrote the Constitution. So what you have in most Indian villages is an area of the village that's a bit separate to the rest of the village. That's where these people live. It's where any stream has already been polluted by the washing and all the things that the caste Hindus have done with the water, so that they get the worst food, the worst water. They are fair game for anybody who wants to give them a hard time. This was the world that Ambedkar was born into. into a population of people, and that population was about 10% of the Indian population. This was the world that Ambedkar grew up in, but by a series of flukes, and time's too short really to go into them, he became obsessed with the idea of getting educated. He did hatch a plan at an earlier stage in his life when he was very young to run away from home and get a job in a cotton mill in one of the towns. But this attempt was foiled, and he instead, rather perversely, as his way of trying to get free, decided to educate himself. And by dint of sheer hard work and sometimes chicanery, because his kind of person wasn't actually allowed to enjoy education in that society, he nevertheless managed to get educated to the level of matriculation, beyond which an enlightened Maharaja of Baroda, who was trying to see if there was some way of helping to uplift the lowest classes, gave him a scholarship to come to, first of all, Columbia University in New York, and then to the London School of Economics. And then finally he studied in Bonn and ended up, as a young adult with 2 PhDs and being a barrister, this extraordinarily qualified, unprecedentedly qualified man from the so-called untouchable class. He came back to India with this level of education and found that when he took up his position in this Maharaja's ministry, the Maharaja having a ministry because he ruled one of the areas of India, people treated him like dirt. If he needed a book, even the lowest clerks would throw it onto his desk because they wouldn't want to touch him or go near him. And he realized with this incredible shock that despite being a barrister, despite having this extraordinary level of educational qualification, he was still considered to be not merely an outsider, but an untouchable. And that was the kind of turning point in his life. Up till then, I think he assumed he would just act as a barrister and maybe work in some way in government civil service on a local or national level. But this experience instead turned him towards doing whatever he could and using all his skills, all his powers of legal knowledge and articulation and so on to bring about the uplift of his people. So in the coming years, he founded educational societies. He founded a whole system of hostels where kids from the poorest places could go and live in a place where there would be light, where they'd be cared for, where there'd be food, where there'd be a little bit of peace, where they too could maybe educate themselves into a new level of maybe some level of financial freedom and so on. He founded all sorts of benevolent societies, and he founded a political party, notably the Republican Party of India. India being very image conscious, every party has its symbol, its icon, and it also has its color. And that's why if you go to India, you'll see most of our people wear something blue, because that was the color associated with Ambedkar's Republican Party of India. So the years went by. He did all this work, founding various societies, fighting various cases in India, where there was some kind of legal possibility of righting a wrong that had been perpetrated against the so-called untouchables. And as independence started to become obviously something approaching, he got himself involved in the conferences that were going on and the discussions that were going on about the kind of society India was going to be. It might surprise you, but in this work he found himself often at quite extreme opposition to Mahatma Gandhi. I mean, Gandhi was a great man, and I don't think any Indian will deny that. But Gandhi was also a traditionalist. Ambedkar's fear was that when the British left India, traditional India would assert to its fullest potential the Hindu system and therefore the Hindu arrangement of society. And he was very, very concerned that when the British left, the untouchables might even lose the kind of freedoms and the kind of opportunities that they'd had under the Raj. And in his view, Gandhi was quite possibly part of that. For all his liberal views, Gandhi believed in the caste system as an ideal way of maintaining the stability of society, even untouchability, who he as a kind of bit of spin renamed the Harijans, the children of God. But as far as Ambedkar could see, Gandhi's liberal views didn't go far beyond just giving the untouchables a new name. So they kind of fought at times quite bitterly. In particular, Ambedkar wanted the British to, or the new regime to emerge in the after the departure of the British, to allow the untouchable classes to have their own constituencies from which they could elect their own MPs. Gandhi was very strongly against this, and even though the British, at the time he was in a British prison, Gandhi set out on one of his fasts unto death in protest to Ambedkar's desire for separate electorates for the untouchables. And in the end, Ambedkar gave way. And nevertheless, once India became independent, at least managed to win some reserved places for the untouchable people in education and in the civil service. But as the moment of independence drew closer, it was pretty obvious to Nehru and the members of the Congress Party that you couldn't ignore Ambedkar, not just because he was the leader of a vast mass of Indian people who, in what was to be a democracy, would be one huge voting bloc. So they wanted him in the tent, but also, they naturally deferred to his brilliance as a lawyer and constitutionalist. And so when independence was granted, Ambedkar was given the post of law minister and was asked to chair the committee responsible for drafting the new constitution. And that constitution outlawed untouchability, and as I mentioned a moment ago, gave the untouchables these reserved places in certain important areas of Indian society. So from being a boy, probably even without shoes, who probably had to walk miles to school every day, who wasn't allowed to even own a pencil, here he was, the law minister of India and the unquestioned leader of about, I can't remember at the time, I think it was in the area of 100 million people, which at the time of independence was the untouchable segment of Indian society, about 1 million people. You could say, well, great, well done, mission achieved. You couldn't really do better than to become law minister and make untouchability something illegal. But Ambedkar knew India and he knew his people. He knew that in those days, possibly still, but certainly in those days, most Indians lived in the village, which he would describe as a sink of ignorance and depravity. He knew that caste and untouchability was hardwired into the consciousness of each and every Indian, whatever their status, whatever their caste, whatever their position in society. And so for him, it was obvious that even political success, even the legal outlawing of untouchability wasn't going to be enough. Something more was needed to counteract hundreds, if not thousands of years of oppression, thousands of years of a very, very fixed, rigid, highly stratified society, at the bottom of which lay 100, 10, 20, 30, whatever it was, million people. So what to do. His answer was religion. Inevitably, he got into various disputes with Nero's government and eventually resigned his post and gave up politics. What instead he turned his attention to was seeing if there was a spiritual, a religious solution to the problem of untouchability, and a problem that he saw as being bigger than that of his own people. His mission became not merely the liberation of his own people, but as he saw it, and I'm convinced this is true of him, because I think he was an absolute visionary, he wanted to free India from the stain of its own, you know, its own depravity as he saw it, the ignorance out of which caste division, inequality, violence, and so on emerged. You know, was it possible not merely to free his people, but to free India from itself? The answer, he thought, didn't lie in politics. You know, he thought it had to lie in some transformation that would take place in the heart and mind of each and every Indian. It was an astonishing epiphany, quite eccentric. You can imagine that he had the power, being the uncontested leader of the untouchable masses, to join forces with the Communist Party and bring about some kind of revolution. And even to this day, there are people in India, people from that depressed class, who bitterly regret that that wasn't the path he took. But he didn't believe in it. He didn't think that mere political change, and certainly not violent political change, would be enough, that what was needed for India was a complete spiritual transformation. Initially, you know, one by one, in the hearts and minds of Indian individuals, eventually coalescing into a more and more increasingly enlightened attitude more generally in Indian society. At a relatively early stage in his life, you know, in his political life, he declared once upon a time that he said, although I was born a Hindu, I promise, I swear, I will not die as a Hindu. Just two stories I'll tell, just to kind of give a little bit of color. There's a book called the Manusmriti. It's a sort of book that you know, that comes out of Hindu tradition, which outlines the duties of each member of each caste. You know, what are their religious duties? What are their religious dharmas, as the phrase would have it? And in that book, for example, untouchables are, it's made clear that untouchables shouldn't even listen to or overhear anybody chanting the sacred scriptures. The punishment being to have lead, molten lead, poured into their ears. You know, this was a religious text. On one occasion, Ambedkar took a copy of the book and set it on fire in front of a huge audience. It was an outrageous act of blasphemy. What's interesting is that while his own followers, you know, applauded, those who weren't scared, because I think, you know, even a lot of his followers would have found that hard to take. But the act led to rioting and violence and very unpleasant protests from the Hindus in the surrounding area. On another occasion, he did something infinitely milder, you could say, than burning a book, which was to step down into the steps of a tank. And a tank in an Indian town or village is a kind of, it's a tamed pond. It has stone or concrete sides. It's a place where people will draw water, wash clothes, wash their water buffaloes, and so on. It's a public area it's a public lake, if you like. What Ambedkar did was just walk down the steps into the tank with some of his closest followers and just take some of the water in his hand and sip it. You know, the result was not just more violent protests, beatings and worse, but the local Hindus, in order to purify the water from this taint of untouchability, poured gallons and gallons of cow's urine and excrement into the water on the ground that would ritually purify it from this act that Ambedkar had committed. This was the world that he was living in. This was the world that he believed that no law would be able to affect, certainly not at village level and possibly not even at the level of the towns. So he decided to become a sort of spiritual revolutionary, to begin a kind of what he called a Dharma revolution, some revolution in the hearts and minds of men brought about through religion. Religion because, you know, it's religion that meets people's hearts and minds in the deepest place, and religion because in the end you just have to accept India is a profoundly religious culture. Of course, though, it couldn't be any religion. Hinduism was a religion, and as far as he was concerned, Hinduism sanctioned the worst excesses of untouchability. So for some years, I mean, people argue about this. Some people think he always had Buddhism in mind, but you know, the fact is, for some years he didn't declare himself. He read widely. You know, it was just a habit of his life. He was an obsessive scholar. For him, knowledge was power, and whether it was about the law or religion, the man read and read and read. He read while he ate, he read while he traveled, he read in bed. Apparently, he never didn't have a book in his hands. I've been to one of his libraries in Aurangabad, and that's just one of his libraries at one of his kind of traveling homes, and it was a very extensive library even there. And of course he was hotly pursued, not just by the communists, because of course they were after him and the voting bloc he represented, but the Christians were after him, the Muslims were after him, and the Sikhs were after him. Everybody wanted Ambedkar to bring his followers out of Hinduism into their fold. You know, presumably because they believed that that way lay salvation, but also because, again, it would make, in that world, it would make their community far more powerful, far more prosperous in the long run. Ambedkar, it said, would sometimes jump into a taxi in order to escape people who he could see knocking on his door. You know, he'd be coming home and he'd see a little contingent from the Sikh community or the Muslim community knocking on his door or trying to get into his office. And he would run away and sometimes get a taxi to take him to another part of town so he could get on with his work undisturbed. But eventually, he chose Buddhism out of the religions. Now, why? Well, for a start, again, India being India, it was important to him that the origins of Buddhism lay in India. He didn't think it would be appropriate or the right kind of fit if his followers chose a foreign religion as he saw it. So it was Buddhism. He saw that Buddhism was potentially modern in that he didn't see anything in Buddhism that necessarily conflicted with reason or science. He really respected the Buddha's vision that for a Buddhist, the Dharma has to be a matter of experience, and that until then, you really tugged it around, you questioned it, you worked with it, you didn't just accept anything on blind faith. And of course, Hinduism is a world of blind faith and gods. And of course, at the very heart of Buddhism is not a god. Above all, perhaps this was what attracted Ambedkar to Buddhism, that the Buddha was an exceptional human being, a human being even who you could say had through his own efforts transcended many aspects of the human state. But he was born a human being and revealed through his life the potential at the heart of every human being. And it was this, I think, in particular, that attracted Ambedkar, that what the Buddha said, what Buddhism says is that everyone of any class, of any background, of any gender, any race, has at their heart the potential to strive, to move forward, to improve themselves, even to become a Buddha. You know, and for Ambedkar, this was probably the deal maker. You know, there were other elements as well. I think he spoke on one occasion, and you have to kind of translate maybe his Indian English, that most religions have a God, but Buddhism has morality. That morality, he said, is the God of Buddhism. What I think he meant with that is that Buddhism upholds universal values, values that rest not on the word of some God or some external commandment, but which take their kind of root from the very heart of the human experience, and the human experience in relation to other humans. One of his slogans was, you know, one that you're very familiar with: liberty, equality, fraternity. And he made it very clear on one occasion. He said, people think I got this from the French Revolution. They're wrong. I got these values from my master, the Lord Buddha. As he saw it, that the Dharma, when practiced, put one in touch with that element of humanity out of which those values quite naturally, organically emerge. You know, so for him, Buddhism represented a departure from the religion of blind faith, the religion of rigid rules, rigid stratification, and, you know, dreadful inequality, you know, to a world, a culture potentially of liberty, equality, and fraternity. So that was his decision. It was to be Buddhism. And at this point, in a way, this is where we enter the story. Along the way, although Ambedkar found himself increasingly drawn towards the principles of Buddhism, he was almost put off by the Buddhists he met and by what he perceived as being the Buddhist world in India. The monks, the few monks who were still around in India, because of course Buddhism had been dead there for many hundreds of years, the monks that he saw seemed to be rather indolent, rather apathetic, not very interested in helping people. Even after after he was clearly going to be a Buddhist, and he met, you know, more and more monks, he was quite shocked by their behavior and their lack of spiritual sincerity. He was also really shocked that the Nagabodhi Society, which was the sort of foremost Buddhist organization in India, was more or less completely overrun and chaired by Brahmins, caste Hindus from the highest caste. So although he was drawn to Buddhism, he had very strong views, which he expressed in a number of talks and essays. And he was very, very critical of the Buddhism he met. And it was on reading some of these essays that Ambedkar wrote that made Sangharakshita, living up in Kalimpong, gave him the idea of writing to Ambedkar, expressing his total agreement with some of Ambedkar's criticisms of the Buddhist world. And as a result of it, they met. And, you know, they shared their thinking, they shared their ideas. A little bit later, once Ambedkar had finally decided that he wanted to convert and he wanted to bring a number of his people with him, he asked Sangharakshita to give a talk to some of his followers, interestingly in Dharavi, which has been in the news just recently as the biggest slum in India, if not in Asia. But in Dharavi, Sangharakshita gave a talk to, you know, many thousands of Ambedkar's followers, including some of his closest lieutenants, explaining what it would mean to convert to Buddhism. On the strength of that, Ambedkar asked Sangharakshita if he would conduct the ceremony at which he would be converted, take diksha, to use their expression. But Sangharakshita said, no, it would be much, much better if you get somebody, you know, from the subcontinent to conduct that ceremony rather than a foreigner. And so that's what happened. Now, shortly after the conversion ceremony, where 300,000 members of the untouchable castes or subcastes converted to Buddhism, 6 weeks later, Ambedkar died. It was an appalling tragedy, obviously for Ambedkar, but also for his people. By then, around, particularly around Maharashtra, but elsewhere in India, thousands and thousands more of these formerly untouchable people, now more normally known as Dalits, the oppressed, were conducting their own conversion ceremonies and becoming Buddhists. And yet nobody from the Buddhist world had particularly responded to this. Ambedkar had written a book as a kind of pocket Bible for his people called The Buddha and His Dharma. But he died. He just died, not particularly suddenly, but it was an illness that took him away in his mid-60s. Everything, in a way, everything was hanging on by a fingernail at that point, because the conversions had started, they were underway. There was this vision of changing society through the practice of Buddhism, and the leader of the whole movement had died. By a really strange coincidence, and there's a really good story behind it, which I'm not going to tell you, it's for another time, Sangharakshita was in Nagpur on the night that Ambedkar died. Nagpur was the place where that first conversion ceremony took place. Now, Ambedkar's funeral was happening down in Bombay, or Mumbai as it now is, and there would have been hundreds of thousands of people present there, but there were still thousands of people in Nagpur that night. And it turned out that nobody was able to speak. There was an enormous gathering with loudspeakers and tannoy system, but one by one, these close followers of Ambedkar would get up on the back of a rickshaw. There hadn't been time to create a stage. They got back on the back of a rickshaw and tried to talk to people and and comfort them, or just share grief, but they couldn't even speak. The only person who could speak was Sangharakshita, who urged Ambedkar's followers to stay with the vision, to stay with the Dharma, that they could keep Ambedkar alive if they could only realize his vision by practicing and effecting the changes he wanted them to make. And over the next few days, he gave a number of talks all over the Nagpur area. And in the following years, and until probably the mid-90s, around the early to mid-90s, Sangharakshita at every opportunity, went to the plains of India. When he lived in Kalimpong, he'd go down to the plains in the winter and spend weeks, even months, just addressing in village after village after village, or town after town, the followers of Ambedkar, just encouraging them to practice, teaching them what Buddhist practice is. Even in those days when I was with him in 1982, and then again when I went back in 85 to research my book, there were very, very few Buddhists from anyone but our movement who took this movement of mass conversion, as it was called, seriously. I once at dinner, and brace yourself if you may not like this, but I once over dinner asked Sangharakshita why he thought the Tibetans, who of course had moved to India after the Tibetans had taken over, the Chinese had taken over Tibet. I said, are they at all interested in helping the Dalit movement of mass conversion? And he gave a sort of harumph and said, well, there's no money in it. And that's maybe a very harsh judgment, but it seemed that whether there was some almost residual antipathy towards people from what was generally considered still in India to be a very, very depressed class of people. Very few Buddhists. There were 2 or 3 monks whose names one knew, who were working like Sangharakshita in that world, but otherwise almost nothing was happening. There would be little viharas in most towns, But what would happen would be that some monks from Thailand or Burma would come, and they would maybe teach a few chants, receive dana in the form of food, and move on. It was a really sad display, it has to be said, and Buddhism didn't kind of shine, through those years. There's more going on now. There's always been a lot of politics, by the way, but we won't go there. But gradually, particularly, our movement has been busy. Trilokyabada Mahasangha Sahik Gama, that's the name of our movement in India. I think it now, I can't quite remember where Triratna fits into the Indian name that we call ourselves at the moment in India. But I guess, why there was that picture of Ambedkar dominating this enormous auditorium on our convention is that still Ambedkar is the key behind a whole movement of transformation. It is a genuinely, I think, unique social experiment that you have, what are now something like, I think, 300 million people from the depressed classes. Some, certainly not all, it's still a minority of those people who converted to Buddhism. But that's still happening. The vision hasn't gone away, and all the time there are people from different areas, different localities, different parts of India, who are coming to some of our centers, our training college, Nagaloka in Nagpur and so on, to find out about Ambedkar and how to practice Buddhism. And this experiment of seeing if it's possible to affect a transformation of society through the transformation of individuals through the practice of the Dharma continues to this day. I mean, it's quite eccentric. I'm not aware of anything like it in the world, but it continues. It's quite remarkable to be with these people. The people who we work with, whether it's setting up a talk or setting up an educational project or a health project, the various social projects that we're engaged in there. But the people you'll meet are just on fire with a kind of, it's very hard to see where for them Dharma and the change in society, where they don't meet. It's really all of a piece. And this is in tune with the way I think Indians see themselves. Very early on in this tour I was on with Sangharakshita in 1982, I would hear him give talks, and he would talk about how practicing the precepts made you a better husband, a better member of society, that you would give up dowry marriages and so on. And I asked him over breakfast whether, is this how we draw people in India with this kind of thing? And then once they're involved, then we sort of get much more involved in their more personal psychology. And he just laughed and said, well, that's your Western take on things. People here think of themselves first and foremost as members of a community. That is their experience of themselves. So again, Dharma, practicing Dharma for somebody in our Indian world is at least as much, if not more, about being a better member of their community, even if it's just of the family, but of their broader community too. And so for them, this idea that I know we sort of work with it, in some of our texts of vision and transformation, there is no sort of difference. There's a social vision. I mean, the need for uplift is still incredibly powerful. All the time, one hears of rapes, of beatings, even if untouchability is illegal. It is still going on at village level, even at small town level. And the need for uplift, the need for more and more people to have opportunities, at work, in their lives, it still exists. And, what tests seem to be showing is that for many people, Dharma practice, developing confidence, developing the empathy, developing a sense of responsibility, developing a stronger, more engaged social vision is working, is taking root. India's not transformed. If anything, the clock would be turned backwards by the present government, and time will only show what unfolds there. But it is interesting the extent to which Ambedkar's star is still shining. Back in 1982-85, people had heard of him, but tended to talk about him as a failed politician who'd converted to Buddhism as a sort of stunt to give himself a bit of fame at the end of his life. I mean, I'd bump into that attitude talking to caste Hindus on trains. That was the kind of common view of him. Just as Buddhism, in their eyes, was just another form of Hinduism. But now, Ambedkar's star's rising. Even Modi, if he's confronted with an image of Ambedkar in some public place, will bow and revere him. He's recognised even at that level in Indian society as a great figure, a great reformer, even if not everyone is prepared to accept that. Probably the most important and revolutionary thing he did with his life was to convert to Buddhism and urge his millions of followers to do the same. I think I'll just finish it with a quote from him. My final words of advice to you are: educate, agitate, and organize. Have faith in yourself. With justice on our side, I do not see how we can lose our battle. The battle to me is a matter of joy. The battle is, in the fullest sense, spiritual. There is nothing material or social in it, for ours is a battle not for wealth or for power. It is a battle for freedom. It's the battle of reclamation of the human personality. Thanks.
Jai Bhim.
Jai Bhim.
So, Jai Bhim, victory to Ambedkar. That's what the Ambedkarites and the Triratna Buddhists say, to recognise Ambedkar. Thank you so much, Nagabodhi. It's so moving just to hear that journey that he made, and incredibly vast the influence of one man with that kind of vision. Thank you very much. So we've got some time to ask Nagabodhi any questions we want, but we also have an invitation for those of you who've joined from the intro course this week. We've set up a separate Zoom meeting if you'd like to leave this meeting with us and hop over there and have some time to check in with Badra, Vaimati and Jonica and each other. I have put the link for that meeting into the chat box where it has just appeared. So all you need to do is cut and paste the web address, put it in your web browser, and it will take you to that other meeting if you'd like to leave us and join that meeting. You're very welcome to stay with us, but we thought you guys might like a chance to check in with each other. So I think Naravira has unmuted all of us.
Yes, I have. We're still recording, so we thought we'd record the question and answers. So I'm going to, at the moment, I've got it pinned on Nagabodhi, so it's just him whilst he was talking. But I'm going to unpin so that people can appear and disappear. If you don't want to be seen, because we might be putting, well, we're certainly putting, we may put the question and answer on if that's all right with everybody. If you don't want to appear on the recording, just put your camera to stop video. That way you won't hear. Obviously your voice will have to arrive asking another question. Is that clear?
Thanks, Naravira. So,
the camera just flips around to the loudest, sorry, the Zoom camera, yeah, it just flips around to the loudest noise. So if you make a noise, you'll suddenly appear on the recording.
Hi, Vijaya. Do you hear me now?
Yes, we do, Vijaya.
yeah.
Oh, okay. I just had one question. I was just wondering if that great quote came from the last words of Ambedkar, or was it well before the time he died?
Ah, interesting. You know, I don't know. It's his final words of advice to you are educate, agitate, organize was his slogan, was his first really major slogan, which you'll find repeated in posters, you know, all over the place. I don't know. I imagine it would have been around the time of his conversion, so it would have been close to his death. Whether they were his final words, you know, I don't know. Sangharakshita met him very, very close to the time of his death, and he was so exhausted. He really wanted to talk to Sangharakshita. He really wanted to kind of almost give a final transmission to him of the importance of his vision and his project. But the way Sangharakshita has described that experience was that Ambedkar's, as they spoke, Ambedkar just slumped and slumped until literally he had his head leaning on the table and he was
Wow.
still talking. So great was his desire to kind of get across to Sangharakshita, you know, the urgency of the situation. So I think his final words were probably much less flowery than the ones I read you, but they would have been sort of around the time he converted, I imagine.
Yes, thank you.
Something I could just interject is that you might find the answer to that question in volume 9 of Sangharakshita's complete works, which is called Dr. Ambedkar and the Revival of Buddhism. And you get Bhante Sangharakshita's book about Dr. Ambedkar, and also copies of the transcripts of many of the lectures that Bhante gave in India, probably some of them on that tour with you, Nagabodhi.
Yeah, I think they're all there, yes.
Yeah, so it's a really lovely resource, and it does give you a much fuller picture of Dr. Ambedkar's life. So just to mention that.
Great.
Can I ask a question? It's Deborah Coates here. Has the lot of the Indian untouchables actually improved? Has there been a bit of improvement in their conditions and the laws surrounding them, or is it still really atrocious?
Okay. Well, I remember in 82, even then, 1982, Sangharakshita, you know, there would be crowds of anything up to 10,000 attending the talks he was giving on those evenings in different towns around Maharashtra, Uttar Pradesh, Madhya Pradesh, Gujarat. And he often complimented them on the fact that they looked a little more prosperous. Now, part of that was because of the so-called Green Revolution that had generally brought more prosperity to India in sort of the years since independence. But no, I think what I'd say is that partly the gains that Ambedkar made as a politician have helped his class, and those gains in particular were what were known as the reservations, and these were reserved positions in government service, which could be something we call the civil service, but it could include the railways, anything government owned. There was a 15% reservation made available to people from the formerly untouchable classes, and also in education, and particularly in higher education. So this was something that Ambedkar won for the ex-untouchables at the time of independence, which made a difference. Paradoxically, what the government tried to do when Ambedkar converted to Buddhism was to say that by converting, these ex-untouchables were no longer Hindus and were no longer ex-untouchables, so they were no longer eligible for these reserved places. So that was another big fight that had to be won. So yeah, on the level of politics and so on, there's that gain that came out of Ambedkar's work. But in terms of the impact of the Dharma on their lives, I suppose, I can only say anecdotally, from people I've met and friends of mine who work in India, the level of self-confidence, the level of freedom from caste oppression and caste attitudes. I mean, you know, you just got to imagine. You know, it's hard to imagine. I mean, I come from a background. My father was Jewish, my mother wasn't. So I had some taste of you know, a connection with, you know, the Jewish experience, you know, in the last century. You know, something I kind of grew up in that world. Meeting people from the untouchable world, or you know, the ex-untouchable world. You know, my mind was still boggled by the world they'd come out of, the stories they would tell me. You know, that for hundreds and hundreds of years, you know, people who'd not been allowed to educate themselves, not been allowed to read, you know, to enter a place. Can you hear me?
Yes, it's all right. I just muted everybody.
Ah, okay, yeah.
Just because there's lots of interference. So I am briefly. You're on again.
Yeah, it was very hard. I mean, I remember saying to somebody I was talking to who was telling me yet another story of this appalling degradation that he lived, you know, that he lived with as a child, in that sort of the form of the pre-independence world. I said, this is like listening to science fiction, you know, and you imagine that this would go back in your life for generations, both as a victim of it and as somebody who complacently lived, you know, in the caste Hindu world. I mean, this stuff was so profoundly hardwired that any gain somebody makes through the practice, even say of, you know, of meditation, you know, of discovering their own consciousness, of having you know, having an experience of themselves free of their position in society. You know, it's a liberation that we possibly can't imagine. We don't realize, you know, just how much and how deeply our experience of everything is conditioned. I mean, we're Buddhists because we've got a glimpse of that, but you know, that level of conditioning is so subliminal, so profound, and for people to have found themselves even momentarily outside of it through meditation, or more generally outside of it through their experiences in Sangha, of spending more and more time with people who have freed themselves. Yes, this has an effect on the kind of jobs they apply for. It has an effect on their ambition within the worlds that are opened up to them. It certainly has an effect on their kids. I mean, something that quite a lot of people in, you know, our sort of Buddhist society in India are dealing with are the fact, you know, it's one of those paradoxical and perverse sides of progress, is that they have to deal with the fact that their kids can earn in a month what they earned in a lifetime. You know, you would think this is wonderful, but it's bringing about sort of, you know, quite a recognizable sort of psychological syndrome. You know, so great is the change, and you know, it's the way the kind of the confidence and the outward goingness and freedom of spirit that, you know, that Dharma practice is bringing to at least some people. You know, it's still in a way, I think we're dealing with something geological. I mean, it's certainly historical, and in some respect, it's socially geological. I'm just going to read another Ambedkar quote. He said, "There's no use in pursuing a certain path if the path is not going to be a lasting one. If it's going to lead you into the jungle, if it's going to lead you to anarchy, there's no use in pursuing it. But if you're assured that the path you're asked to follow is slow, maybe devious, maybe with long detours, yet ultimately makes you reach safe, sound ground, so that the ideals are there to help you to mold your life permanently, it's much better, in judgment, to follow the slower path rather than to rush up and take shortcuts." I mean, Ambedkar knew that he was asking something of his people that was in a way almost unimaginable, like planting the seeds, you know, of oak trees and saying, you know, this is worth doing because one day there'll be oak trees there. You know, you might not even see the saplings. You know, I think he knew that he was looking at a very, very long drawn out process, but if it worked, it wouldn't just bring about the uplift of the old untouchables, but it would transform India. So work in progress. But I think, yeah, you know, you do see, you know, in the short term, you do see these fruits. And I hear many stories, you know, and the kind of work we're doing that Karana funds, you know, some of which is like job training schemes, you know, computer skill training schemes and so on, for example, you know, are included in the various ways in which people are grabbing the opportunities that their new mind state opens them to.
Could you say something about the shoes?
The shoes. Well, if you remember, somebody once, you know, got into the world media because he threw a shoe at George Bush. It's one of those ultimate signs of, you know, it's an abusive act. The reason that there are a lot of jobs in the railway network for you know, the ex-untouchable people, whether they're Buddhist or not, is because, well, the working on the railways brings you into contact with the ground, and the ground is polluted. And so a lot of untouchable professions had to do with the ground. And the shoes, of course, being a cobbler is, you know, a cobbler is an untouchable job. Or, you know, was in old India, you know, if you worked with, you know, you wouldn't work with shoes unless you came from a particular subcaste of one of the untouchable castes. So to throw, you know, the reason they put cages around statues of Ambedkar in some places is because people going past would throw shoes as a basically as an insult. I mean, you know, he certainly, you know, he was a controversial figure, and like I say, he was not afraid to commit, you know, what would be certainly regarded as blasphemous acts. But just as Sangharakshita, you know, suggested that Buddhists might need to engage in therapeutic blasphemy, I think when Ambedkar burnt the Manusmriti or took water from the tank in that Brahmin area of a town, he wasn't just making a stand against the people who lived in that town. He was in a way shocking his own people. You know, he was committing on their behalf an act of blasphemy to, in a sense, shake them into a recognition of the depth of their conditioning that they had to free themselves from.
Thank you, Nagabodhi. We had a question that came up when we were studying the module on Ambedkar. It really seemed to bring out how strongly influenced by Ambedkar Sangharakshita was, because he was in his 20s when he met Ambedkar, and we got very interested in to what extent, obviously there's not an absolute answer to this, but Sangharakshita's whole emphasis on the new society and that whole social dimension of Dharma practice, we started to just get a sense that Ambedkar had been such a strong influence there. I just wondered if you had any thoughts about that.
Well, I mean, I think he said it himself, you know, that Sangharakshita did sort of open his eyes, you know, to the social dimension, the social potential of Dharma practice. I mean, I guess, yeah, as you say, if the conversion was in 1956, Sangharakshita would have been 31. 25, yeah, 31. And they met a few years before. So yes, he met Ambedkar in his late 20s. I mean, by then, you know, I've been writing a foreword for a volume of Sangharakshita's writings that he wrote in his late teens and 20s. And his take on the Dharma by then was almost immediately unbelievably broad and all-embracing. So I don't think Sangharakshita hadn't thought about these things, but I think Ambedkar's vision really, without doubt, inspired him. And I think he's himself, you know, admitted that, you know, Sangharakshita's vision of actually changing an entire society through the practice of Dharma, you know, did wake him up to that potential. And in a sense, well, in a way, I think that dimension of the Buddha's teaching. I mean, the Buddha himself spoke out against caste and untouchability, even though in the Buddha's day, these things were still at a very, very basic and crude level. But there was untouchability. There was, stratification and inequality, and the Buddha spoke out at every opportunity against that. So even in his time, the Buddha was something of a revolutionary, and I guess Ambedkar saw himself as following in that dimension of the Buddha's footsteps. And I think when we sort of accidentally in the early days of our movement started creating our little new society worlds around centers, businesses, communities, Sangharakshita was to some extent following accidental developments in our world, but he was, I think, getting more and more aware that, oh yes, this really is part of Dharma practice. This doesn't need to be seen as something happening on the side. This could really be changing our lifestyles, changing our own world, and hopefully spreading influence into the surrounding world, was exactly what Ambedkar had been hoping his people would do. I mean, it is tragic that he died when he did. It's very fortunate that Sangharakshita, was also there and took him so seriously. But it's fascinating to ponder, how much more might have happened had Ambedkar lived longer, and also fascinating to ponder whether he and Sangharakshita would have had more to do with each other, because, as I say, very few other Buddhists living in India at the time, had much sort of interest or sympathy for Ambedkar. I mean, the leading figure at the Nagabodhi Society wrote to Ambedkar, sent a telegram to Ambedkar saying, deeply shocked to hear of your decision to renounce Hinduism, but if you and your followers so choose to join us in the Buddhist fold, you will be made cordially welcome. Very, very strange. But the first line was, we're shocked to hear of your decision to renounce Hinduism. He just didn't understand, didn't get it.
Not at all. Gosh. Thank you. Thank you. So Noravira and I are thinking we've got time for another question or two, and that we've moved into
Losing Saturday a bit there.
I think called Indian stretching time, where things take on their own organic kind of way.
We couldn't hear you, Satchalila, unfortunately.
Hear me now?
Tim raised the finger, but I don't know if he's.
Yeah, okay. I'll try and fill in for what Satchalila was going to say. So yeah, we were going to originally finish about 10 past 9, and then with the meditation, but I didn't want to. Neither of us wanted to stop for the question and answers because they were so interesting. So we've still got a little time for maybe a question or two, and then we're going to just end probably 10 or quarter past with the transference of merits. So if anyone else has got a question for Nagabodhi, just unmute yourselves and feel free.
So,
Okay.
I've got a question. When you're saying when Dr. Ambedkar.
Can you put your microphone nearer your mouth?
I
can't hear you.
If I unplug this, I think it'll work. Yeah. When you were saying that Dr. Ambedkar was asked about what was the importance of Buddhism, at least in India, he talked about the reclamation of the personality. And I was wondering, in what ways does that have a shared relevance here in Britain and in the West? Are there ways in which it's not relevant here? And are the ways in which the shared relevance? And I was also wondering, does it relate to what Sangharakshita spoke about when he talked about the true individual?
Yeah, that's what I take it to mean. Bear in mind that either Ambedkar's being translated, and the word personality, I thought of changing it when I read it, but I thought, well, no, I can't change it. You know, it's maybe what Ambedkar actually said, but of course Ambedkar spoke, you know, very, very good English, but actually often quite Indian English as well. I take it to mean, yes, something much closer to what Sangharakshita is getting at with true individuality. I'd certainly see it as being way beyond personality, as we use the term, you know, in terms of the persona and always one's outward, you know, appearance in society. No, I mean, I think he was getting at, it's the battle of reclamation of human character, of, if you like, yeah, of truly human individuality, of each person finding, you know, who am I really? Take away, you know, this identification that's imposed on me of being untouchable. You know, what am I really? You know, what is my real strength? What is it really like to be me? And what am I capable of? You know, what opportunities might I take, you know, in the world? What opportunities might I take in my inner world? So I think Ambedkar's vision, you know, freedom, liberty, equality, fraternity. Equality was one aspect of it, but when talking about fraternity, he definitely meant something that we think of as meta. You know, in some of his writings, it's obvious that he's talking about fraternity as a really profound fellow feeling of heart to heart, human to human. And freedom, you know, he definitely meant more than just freedom from caste oppression. He meant freedom of the spirit, you know, freedom to really explore and discover, you know, who we really are, irrespective of what society tries to tell us we are and what we're capable of and so on. So yeah, I think he was reaching to something, you know, much more profound. Yeah, I had another of his quotes here written. Yeah, on that love theme, he says, "I'm quite confident that if we all become 1/10 as enlightened as the Buddha was, we can bring about the same results as those envisaged by the communists, but by the methods of love, of justice and goodwill."
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah. But yeah, you know, it's that good, true individual teaching, or whatever you want to call it, of Sangharakshita's. You know, something, you know, in the early days, you know, it was one of his themes. You know, it was, it's still there. It's still a major theme, but it's maybe not talked about quite so much as it used to be. That emphasis he'd make on becoming a true individual.
Still part of the Mitra study course.
Yeah, yeah. No, I was going to share a different picture, but for some reason the system won't let me.
Okay.
Can I ask another question?
Yes, who's that?
Hi, Vijay. I just wondered if I could ask one more question.
Sure, go ahead.
Last one.
Oh, if it's the last one, I'll hand over to someone else because I've had to go.
Not sure there is anyone else for Jai.
Got it, Jai.
Okay, it's just I might be fooled into thinking that the poor in India. I mean, I really, you know, heart goes out to the situation that a lot of them are in. But strangely, whenever I see pictures from poor areas in India, they come across, it might be just because there's cameras around, but I see them as quite well turned out, you know, quite well scrubbed, clean shirts and so on. I was just wondering what your impressions are, having really been there.
Gosh. Well, there are poor areas and poor areas. I mean, they very, you know, when Modi, you know, brought in the lockdown, there'd be photographs of empty streets in Delhi. And, you know, you just think, yeah, but hang on, where are the hutments? What's going on in the hutments? What's going on in the chawls in Mumbai? Today on, can't remember which, it was, I think maybe the lunchtime news, there was some footage from inside a chawl, these tenement blocks, usually, you know, in very poor areas, but obviously in very poor areas where you can have, you know, several families living in one room and even in the corridors. I mean, to be well turned out, I mean, it would be a rarity. I mean, they might turn themselves out, you know, when Sangharakshita visited, you know, even say Dharavi, the slum area in a major slum area in Mumbai. Yeah, people dress themselves up in, you know, their best clothes. But I think if you're seeing on newsreel footage, people looking well turned out in some of the hutments and chawls, then they're probably not hutments or chawls. I mean, right. people can live really at a very, very basic level even now. You know, it will vary from place to place. I mean, there is more prosperity. There is now, you know, a middle class among even the, you know, the former untouchables. Education has made it possible. Call centers and so on have made those sorts of jobs available, and so on. So there is more prosperity, but there's still enormous amounts of poverty, still in the villages, but also in the towns. There'll still be localities which are entirely, you know, living at an incredibly basic level. And I mean, I cannot imagine what's going on in those places at the moment. The official government statistics are a joke if you know anything about, you know, India at that level. You know, it's inconceivable that people are separating themselves or able to separate themselves, not to mention the ones who've just got stuck on God knows where in trying to get home and failing during the lockdown.
Yeah.
So yeah, I wouldn't be, you know, I'd be, yeah, I wouldn't take those images too seriously. But they, you know, they will do their best, you know, but they'll do their best often, as I say, to on special occasions, you know, to offer, you know, to come to a you know, an Ambedkarite rally or an Ambedkarite talk. But yeah, if they know a camera crew are coming to their area, I'm sure. I mean, Indians are incredibly camera aware. It's probably a bit different now that everyone has a phone, a big camera in their phone. But in 1982, you know, wherever I went with my cameras, and I was there partly to take photos of Bante's tour, wherever I went, huge crowds of people would constantly be maneuvering to be in front of me, so that and asking me to take their picture, even though they, you know, they would never see it because, you know, I was just passing through. But it was incredibly important to have their picture taken. You know, I have my theories as to why that was. But yeah, I can imagine even now, if a camera crew from the BBC shows up, people would probably do their best.
Yeah.
But no, don't be fooled into thinking that there's that level of prosperity in the poorest areas. No, it's still, you know, it's still for some, it's for many, it's still dreadfully poor.
Right. Thank you.
I think we're going to have to start to wind up our evening. It's a shame because there's so much more that we could explore, and it's been so fantastic having Nagabodhi with us, and I feel opening up a whole world that perhaps many of us are not even aware of, a whole, you know, world that includes hundreds of millions of people, and I feel that Nagabodhi's brought it alive very vividly for us, and the fantastic life of Dr. Ambedkar and what is still going on, you know, in India today, and this special connection that Triratna has with the ex-untouchable community through its work through the Karana Trust, through its connection through the order. I mean, there are hundreds of Indian order members. Generally speaking, we don't get to see many of them because it's very hard for them to come over here, but we We have our some of our conventions now in our order conventions in India, and so it's a chance for the order as a whole to get together. So there's more. I mean, we'll put the recording up of Nagabodhi's talk if you want to listen to that again. There's also all sorts of things on the BuddhistCenter.com if you want to find out more about the work of Triratna in India and the TBMSG, the Indian wing of the Triratna movement. You can find out more online and read the book that Satchalila was pointing us towards as well. So tremendous thanks to Nagabodhi. Jai Bhim.
Jai Bhim.
Yes.
Just to say that my book, Jai Bhim, Dispatches from a Peaceful Revolution, it is actually a free download on Sangharakshita's website. If you go to sangharakshita.org, I think it is, and there's ebooks. There's one of the headings is ebooks, and for some reason he put my book Jai Bhim in there, and it's still there as a free download. So although it was written 40 years ago, it's still 30 or 40 years ago. So it's got, it comes out of an earlier Triratna world and an earlier Nagabodhi, but it's there. If you want to have a look at that.
Yeah, great, highly recommended. Thank you very much.
But thanks for asking me. I've enjoyed myself, and it's been lovely to see people from all over the area.
Yeah.
See you again, Tim.
Yeah. Glad to see so many people from Stroud as well coming and joining us. Yeah, always welcome at our classes of Sangha if you want to drop in again.
Thank you.
Okay, I think we're going to just end with the transference of merit. So we'll do this. It's a shame that we can't hear each other, but we can use our imaginations and put our screen on gallery view. We can see many of us. So I'll just lead us in call and response in the transference of merits, and that will be the end for this evening. Don't forget the Dharma bowl if you wish to contribute to the Buddhist Center. Transference of merit and self-surrender. May the merit gained in my acting thus go to the alleviation of the suffering of all beings. My personality throughout my existences, my possessions, and my merit in all three ways. I give up without regard for myself, for the benefit of all beings. Just as the earth and other elements are serviceable in many ways to the infinite number of beings, inhabiting limitless space, so may I become that which maintains all beings, situated throughout space, so long as all have not attained to peace. So that's the end of our class for this evening. So look forward to seeing you again next week. And thanks for showing up. Lovely to see so many people. Thanks again to Nagabodhi.
Yes, thank you very much, Nagabodhi. Thank you so much. Yeah, and next week we're going to be hearing about Ashoka, who's another fascinating, important figure from Indian history. So I hope to see many of you there. Thank you.
So I'll unmute us all so that we can say goodbye if we want.
Thanks very
Thank
much.
you.
Bye.
Happy
Thank
birthday, Dr. Ambedkar. Happy birthday.
Bye.
Thank you.
Lovely to
Bye.
see you all.
Bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank
Lovely
you.
to
Bye.
visit.
Yes, lovely to have
Bye,
you.
everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
See ya. Thank you.
Good night, all.
You all have a good week.
Good night.
Bye.
Okay. If the team stay behind.
Okay. We're going to have a little team debrief.
Yeah.
Sure.
So yeah, if you're still on and
My mouse has stopped working. I can't disconnect.
okay, I might be able to disconnect you. Lisa.
Yeah, please would you? Thank you so much for tonight. It was
Team
great.
meeting forever.
Bye.
Oh, lovely to see you, Lisa. Beautiful shrine.
Right.
Armin.
I'm still here.
What's happened to
Oh.
Armin?
No. Delete me. Delete me.
Armin's-
You're permanent.
Oh no.
Let's see if I can
You've
quickly
become
wait
deathless.
that works.
Ah,
Oh.
she's gone. What about Darman? I can see Darman's screen, but no sight or sound of him.
Oh, yeah. I will remove him as well. Oh, sorry. That didn't work.
I think he's probably gone. Just, it's a bit strange.
Oh, I should have got rid of him.
Hmm.
I'm going to wait until that works.
Yeah. Yeah, you've done it now. Whew. Thank you, Nora Vera.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks for hosting and great introduction. I unfortunately I didn't record your intro. If I'd known, I would have. It would have been
Oh,
nice.
well, not to worry.
Yeah.
No, I just think sometimes it's nice to give people a sense of just, well, like I said, just an extraordinary man.